The North African sun beat mercilessly on the dusty convoy of American trucks winding through the Tunisian landscape in May 1943. Inside the canvas-covered vehicles, a collection of men sat in rigid silence, their gray uniforms stained with desert sand and defeat. These were not ordinary prisoners. Among them sat 3 field marshals, 7 generals, and a dozen colonels, the highest-ranking officers ever captured by American forces in a single operation. General Wilhelm Hartmann sat with his back straight despite the uncomfortable wooden bench, his iron cross still pinned to his tunic. The Afrika Korps had collapsed. Rommel had already escaped back to Europe, leaving his subordinates to face the consequences of Hitler's overreach. Hartmann had commanded 30,000 men just weeks ago. Now he commanded nothing but his own dignity, which he wore like armor. Across from him, Field Marshal Otto Brenner stared at his hands. They were clean now. The American soldiers had allowed them to wash before the journey, but he could still feel the grit of the desert under his nails. He had expected execution, or at the very least, brutal interrogation. The Geneva Convention was a piece of paper. After all, what did words matter in total war? "They will starve us," whispered Colonel Friedrich Weber, young enough to still believe rumors, old enough to have seen terrible things. "I have heard stories of their camps, disease, beatings, starvation rations." Brenner said nothing. He had stopped believing stories months ago. Now he believed only what he could see, touch, and taste. And right now, all he could taste was dust and defeat. The truck hit a pothole, jostling the prisoners. An American guard, barely 20 years old with freckles across his sunburned nose, steadied himself and offered an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that, sirs. Road's pretty rough." The German officers exchanged glances. "Sirs?" The guard had called them sirs. Hartmann felt a twitch of confusion. In his experience, captured enemies were rarely afforded courtesy. He had seen Russian prisoners treated like cattle, French soldiers stripped of their boots and left to march barefoot. This strange politeness unsettled him more than cruelty would have. The convoy reached the port at Tunis 3 days later. A Liberty ship waited in the harbor, its hull painted in the dull gray of war. The prisoners were led up the gangplank in single file, their boots echoing on metal. Brenner paused at the top, looking back at Africa for what he knew would be the last time. The continent had broken them. It had broken the entire German war machine's myth of invincibility. Below deck, they were assigned to quarters that surprised them again. Small cabins instead of holds. Bunks with thin mattresses instead of bare floor. Each man received a blanket, a bar of soap, and a cup. Hartmann ran his fingers over the blanket. It was rough wool, military issue. But it was clean. He had not slept under a clean blanket in 8 months. That first night at sea, lying in darkness as the ship rocked gently, Colonel Weber spoke into the shadows. "Do you think they are softening us for interrogation?" "Perhaps," Hartmann replied. But privately, he wondered if something else was happening. Something he did not yet have words for. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. The prisoners were allowed on deck for 1 hour each morning, always under guard but never chained. They stood at the rail, watching the endless water, each man alone with his thoughts. Some prayed. Some planned escape scenarios they knew were impossible. Some simply let the sea wind wash over their faces and tried not to think at all. Field Marshal Brenner spent his deck time observing the American sailors. They were young, most of them, with an easy camaraderie he had not seen in German ranks for years. They laughed. They sang. One evening, a sailor with a harmonica played folk songs while his companions hummed along. The music drifted to where the prisoners stood, and for a moment, Brenner forgot which side of the war he was on. When the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon, the prisoners crowded to one side of the deck to see it. Even in captivity, even in defeat, the sight of that massive copper woman holding her torch stirred something. Hartmann found himself thinking of the stories his grandmother had told him about her brother, who had emigrated to New York in 1889. He had sent letters describing a land of impossible plenty, streets that never seemed to end, buildings that scraped the sky. Hartmann had thought they were exaggerations, Now, as the ship entered New York Harbor, he wondered if perhaps they had not been exaggerations at all. They were transferred to trains, heading inland. The American countryside rolled past the windows, farms fat with crops, towns undamaged by bombs, children playing in yards who stopped to wave at the passing train. This was a country untouched by war, Hartman realized. Germany was rubble and smoke. Europe was a graveyard. But here, life continued as if the world were not burning. How can we have thought to defeat this? Weber whispered, staring out at a factory complex that seemed to stretch for miles. Look at it. Look at all of it. Nobody answered because nobody had an answer. The train pulled into a small station in rural Mississippi on a June morning, when the air was thick enough to swim through. The prisoners were marched from the platform to waiting trucks for the final leg of their journey. Field Marshal Brenner noticed everything: the well-maintained road, the telephone poles marching into the distance, the abundance of vehicles. Germany was running on fumes and horse carts. America was drowning in gasoline and steel. Camp Clinton appeared suddenly around a bend in the road. It was not what any of them expected. No barbed wire towers looming against the sky, no machine gun nests or searchlights, just a series of long, low barracks arranged in neat rows, surrounded by a single chain-link fence that seemed almost decorative. Beyond the fence, pine trees swayed in the humid breeze. The truck stopped at the main gate. An American colonel emerged from the administration building, his uniform crisp despite the heat. He was an older man, perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen combat in the previous war. He carried a clipboard and wore reading glasses that he removed as he approached. "Gentlemen," he said in heavily accented but comprehensible German, "welcome to Camp Clinton. My name is Colonel Thaddeus Morrison. I am the commandant of this facility. You will be held here as prisoners of war under the provisions of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with the dignity your rank commands. You will not be harmed, starved, or tortured. You will be fed, housed, and provided with medical care. You will follow camp rules, and in return, you will be treated as soldiers, not criminals." Brenner studied Morrison's face for signs of deception. He found none. The American colonel spoke matter-of-factly, as if reading a grocery list rather than making promises that seemed too good to be true. They were led into the camp in groups according to rank. The field marshals and generals were assigned to a separate section not out of special privilege, Morrison explained, but because Geneva protocols required officers to be housed separately from enlisted men. Each officer would have his own room in a barracks that looked newer than some houses Brenner had seen in Germany before the war. Hartman was shown to his quarters by a sergeant named Robert Jackson, a black man from Georgia with a drawl so thick it took Hartman 3 tries to understand his instructions. Jackson opened the door to a small room containing a metal bed frame with a real mattress, a footlocker, a small desk and chair, and a window with glass panes that actually opened. "Linens are in the footlocker," Jackson said. "Dinner is at 1800 hours. That's 6 o'clock. Mess hall is the long building to the east. Can't miss it. You'll hear the bell." Hartman wanted to ask why he was not locked in. He wanted to ask where the guards would be stationed. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but Jackson had already moved on to the next room, his boots echoing down the hallway. Left alone, Hartman sat on the bed. The mattress compressed under his weight. It was not comfortable by peacetime standards, but compared to the ground or a truck bench or a ship's bunk, it felt like luxury. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand what kind of prison this was. At 17:45, a bell rang across the camp. Brenner emerged from his room at the same time as the others. They walked together toward the mess hall, a nervous cluster of men who had commanded armies and now could not command even their own fate. The mess hall doors stood open. The smell hit them first. Brenner stopped so suddenly that Weber nearly walked into his back. It was the smell of roasting meat, real meat, not the mystery tins that passed for rations in the Wehrmacht. Underneath that, fresh bread, coffee, actual coffee, not the roasted acorn substitutes they had been drinking for 2 years. And something sweet, something with cinnamon. "It is a trick," Weber said, "psychological warfare. They feed us once, then take it away. But Hartman was already walking forward, drawn by memory and hunger in equal measure. He had not smelled food like this since before the war, since the last Christmas his family had spent together in 1938, when his mother had made stolen and his father had opened the good wine. Inside the mess hall, American soldiers lined up at serving stations manned by kitchen staff in white aprons. The German officers were directed to a separate section, but the food came from the same kitchen. Morrison stood near the entrance, observing. The Geneva Convention requires that we feed prisoners of war the same rations our own enlisted men receive, he said to Brenner, who happened to be nearby. So that's what you'll get. 3 meals a day. Same as an American private. Brenner took a metal tray and moved through the line in a daze. A cheerful cook with forearms like hams spooned beef stew onto his plate chunks of actual beef, carrots, potatoes, in a rich brown gravy. Another added a mound of mashed potatoes with butter melting on top. A third placed 2 slices of white bread on the tray, so soft and fresh that Brenner could see steam rising from them. At the end of the line, someone added a bowl of sliced apples dusted with cinnamon and sugar. He carried his tray to a table where other German officers sat in stunned silence, staring at their food. "This cannot be real," Weber said. He picked up his fork, then put it down again, as if the food might vanish if he looked away. Hartman cut a piece of beef and lifted it to his mouth. The moment it touched his tongue, his eyes closed. The meat was tender, well seasoned, cooked by someone who knew what they were doing. It was not fancy, no French sauces or elaborate presentation, but it was good. It was honest food, prepared with care, and there was so much of it. Around the table, the other officers began to eat. The silence stretched, broken only by the scrape of forks on metal trays. Field Marshal Brenner chewed slowly, forcing himself not to rush despite the fact that his stomach felt like an empty cavern. He had learned long ago that eating too fast after extended hunger led to sickness. After several minutes, Colonel Heinrich Vogel set down his fork and spoke in a low voice that none of the Americans could hear. "It is better than our officers' mess in Berlin." Heinrich, Hartmann warned. "It is true," Vogel insisted. "That last banquet we attended before deployment, do you remember? All show. Crystal and silver, and Hitler Youth serving boys. But the food was ersatz everything. Fake coffee, bread made from wood pulp filler, mystery meat that might have been horse or rat." This he gestured at his tray. "This is what real food tastes like." I had almost forgotten. Brenner said nothing because Vogel was right. The field marshal had attended dozens of Nazi banquets, long tables groaning under the weight of elaborate centerpieces and propaganda. But the actual food had been increasingly poor as the war dragged on. Everything was substitute, everything was stretched. Everything was fake, except the ideology, which was all too real. But here, in an enemy prison camp in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi, the stew was real, the bread was real, the butter was real. Even the cinnamon on the apples was real. "It tastes better than our banquets," Brenner said quietly. Around the table, several officers nodded. The second week at Camp Clinton brought a rhythm. Wake at 6. Morning roll call at 7. Breakfast at 8. The days stretched long and empty, filled with nothing but time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. Hartman found himself at the same table each mealtime, joined by Brenner, Vogel, and a handful of other senior officers. They formed a small island of German amid a sea of American voices. At first, they spoke only among themselves, carefully avoiding topics that might be overheard and misunderstood. But gradually, inevitably, the boundaries began to blur. It started when Private Marcus Henderson, a young soldier from Iowa tasked with serving coffee, paused by their table. He was perhaps 19, with sandy hair and a gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled. "More coffee, sirs?" he asked in terrible German. Vogel blinked in surprise. "You speak German?" Henderson's ears turned red. "Just a little. My grandma came from Bavaria. She taught me some words." "Your grandmother is from Bavaria?" Vogel leaned forward with interest. "What town?" Munich, I think, or near there." Vogel's face softened in a way Hartmann had not seen since Africa. I am from Munich. Or I was. I do not know what is left of it now. Henderson poured coffee, his hands uncertain. I'm sorry, sir. About the war. About everything. You are sorry? Vogel looked genuinely puzzled. You are not the one who started it. The private moved on. But something had shifted. The next day, Henderson brought them American newspapers with the German text translated in rough handwriting in the margins. The day after that, he mentioned that there was a piano in the recreation hall if any of them played. News of the newspapers spread through the officer ranks quickly. They gathered each evening to read about the war from the enemy's perspective. It was strange seeing themselves described as the aggressors, the evil empire, the darkness spreading across Europe. But it was stranger still to see how thoroughly they were losing. Italy is out, Brenner said one evening, folding a week-old copy of Stars and Stripes. Mussolini arrested. The whole country switching sides. Bombing raids on Hamburg, Hartmann added, his voice hollow. They estimate 40,000 civilian dead. Weber threw his own newspaper down in disgust. Allied propaganda. All lies. Is it? Brenner looked at the younger colonel with tired eyes. We bombed London. We bombed Rotterdam. Did we think there would be no response? Did we think we could burn the world and remain untouched? That night, lying in his narrow bed, Hartmann found sleep difficult. The room was too quiet, too safe. He was used to the sounds of war, distant artillery, aircraft engines, men crying out in their sleep. Here there was only crickets, and the occasional laugh from the American guards playing cards in their quarters. He thought about Henderson's grandmother in Munich. He thought about Hamburg burning. He thought about his own family in Stuttgart, and realized he had not received word from them in over a year. They might be dead. They might be ash. He might be the last Hartmann alive, lying in comfort in an enemy prison while his world ended without him. The next morning at breakfast, Colonel Morrison stopped by their table. He carried his own tray and asked, in his careful German, if he might sit with them. The German officers exchanged glances. This was unusual. Commandants did not typically dine with prisoners. But Morrison settled into a chair before anyone could object, cutting into his eggs with the methodical precision of a man used to military routine. Gentlemen, he said after a moment, I wanted to speak with you about conditions here. If there are any issues with your treatment, I want to know. This camp operates under strict Geneva Convention guidelines, but I am aware that there may be adjustments needed. Brenner set down his fork carefully. Colonel Morrison, I think I speak for all of us when I say that we are confused. Confused? We expected. Brenner chose his words carefully. Different treatment. We are enemies. We have killed American soldiers. American soldiers have killed our men. And yet you feed us, as if we are guests. You give us rooms, books, freedom to move about the camp. Why? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, chewing his eggs thoughtfully. When he spoke, his voice was serious but not unkind. You are prisoners of war. You are not criminals. You followed orders from your government, as soldiers do. Now the fortunes of war have placed you in my custody. The Geneva Convention requires certain treatment, yes. But beyond that, he paused, searching for words. I fought in France in 1918. I saw what happened when we treated each other as animals instead of men. It did not help anyone. It did not end the war faster. It only created more hatred. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. You men commanded troops. You know that soldiers follow orders. When this war ends, and it will end, Germany will still exist. Germans will still exist. At some point, we have to be able to look at each other as human beings again. This camp is my small attempt to make that possible. Vogel spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. You feed us better than our own army fed us. Morrison nodded slowly. I know. That's not because American food is special. It's because your supply lines were overstretched, your economy was strained, and your leadership prioritized ideology over logistics. An army marches on its stomach, as Napoleon said. Germany forgot that. We did not. The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. Hartmann found himself thinking about the last year in Africa, the constant shortage of fuel, food, ammunition. They had been told it was temporary, that new supplies were coming, that the fatherland was strong. But the truth had been visible in every empty transport, every cancelled airdrop, every meal that was more sawdust than bread. We were told, Weber said quietly, that Americans were weak, soft, that you could not fight, could not sacrifice, that your soldiers were cowards who would break at the first sign of hardship. And what do you think now? Morrison asked. Weber looked around the mess hall at the American soldiers eating their breakfast, laughing with each other, most of them barely older than boys. I think we were told many lies. Morrison stood, picking up his tray. Get some rest, gentlemen. If you need anything, my door is open. After he left, the German officers sat in silence. Finally, Brenner spoke. So quietly, the others had to lean in to hear. We have lost more than the war, he said. We have lost the ability to recognize truth from falsehood. And I do not know how we find our way back. By the third week, Camp Clinton had settled into routine, but not the harsh routine the German officers had anticipated. There was structure roll calls, meal times, lights out, but between those fixed points, there was something unexpected. Freedom of a sort. They were allowed to organize themselves. Field Marshal Brenner found himself unofficially leading a committee of senior officers to interface with the camp administration. It was a strange echo of his former command, except now he commanded nothing but the daily minutiae of captive life. One morning, Morrison called Brenner to his office. The commandant's workspace was sparse a desk, filing cabinets, a map of Europe on the wall with pins marking the advancing Allied lines. Morrison gestured for Brenner to sit. I have a proposition, Morrison said. There is land behind the eastern barracks that is sitting unused. Some of your men have mentioned that they miss working with their hands. I am authorized to allow you to create a garden. You may grow vegetables, flowers, whatever you wish. The produce you grow, you may keep for your own meals. All I ask is that you supervise it properly, and that no one attempts to use gardening tools as weapons. Brenner studied the American's face for deception. You would give us shovels, hose, under supervision, yes, and return to the tool shed each evening. Morrison leaned back in his chair. Field Marshal, idle hands cause problems in any military installation. I would rather have you growing tomatoes than plotting escape attempts that will only end in disappointment and possible injury. That afternoon, Brenner stood with a dozen other officers in what would become their garden. The Mississippi soil was red clay, heavy and dense. It would need work, amendments, care, but several of the men had grown up on farms before the military. They knew soil, knew seasons, knew the satisfaction of watching something grow. Colonel Vogel knelt and dug his fingers into the earth. My father had a farm, he said. I swore I would never be a farmer. I wanted to be a soldier, see the world, make something of myself. He laughed bitterly. Now I am neither soldier nor farmer, just a man playing in the dirt. Then let us play, Brenner said, accepting a shovel from an American sergeant. Let us see what we can make grow in this strange soil. They worked through the afternoon, turning earth, pulling weeds, marking rows. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. But it was good to work. It was good to be moving, to have a purpose beyond waiting for the war to end. Private Henderson brought them water and lingered to watch. My pa grows corn, he offered. Says the trick is to plant it knee-high by July. This is your July? Asked Major Klaus Dietrich, wiping sweat from his forehead. Yes, sir. Getting close to it. Too late for corn, then. What else grows here? Henderson scratched his head. Tomatoes do real well. Okra, if you like it. Beans, squash, pretty much anything, if you water it enough and keep the bugs off. Over the following weeks, the garden became a focal point. Men who had commanded panzer divisions now debated the spacing of tomato plants. Officers who had planned complex military operations now strategized about irrigation and pest control. There was something almost absurd about it, but also something deeply necessary. Hartman found himself working alongside Vogel one morning, stringing up supports for climbing beans. "Do you remember the oath we took?" he asked quietly. "When we became officers, to serve Germany with loyalty and bravery," Vogel recited. "To follow orders without question." "Without question," Hartman repeated. "That phrase has been troubling me. We followed orders. We questioned nothing. And now," he gestured at the garden, at the camp, at everything their unquestioning had led to. Vogel tied off a piece of twine. "Now we grow beans in Mississippi and pretend that good soil can make up for bad choices." The garden was not the only new development. Morrison had approved the formation of a camp orchestra. It turned out that Colonel Weber had played violin in his youth, and several enlisted prisoners had musical training. They scavenged and borrowed instruments, a few violins, a cello, a trumpet, an accordion. Twice a week they practiced in the recreation hall, and prisoners gathered to listen. The first concert was rough, the musicians rusty from years without practice. But when Weber drew his bow across the strings and began Beethoven's Ode to Joy, something happened. The music filled the hall, and for those minutes, they were not prisoners and captors. They were simply humans, listening to beauty made by human hands. Brenner stood at the back of the hall, watching American guards sway slightly to the music. One young soldier had his eyes closed, a small smile on his face. Another tapped his fingers against his thigh in time with the rhythm. When the piece ended, everyone applauded, Germans and Americans alike. That night, Brenner wrote in the journal he had been keeping, a habit from his military days. His handwriting was careful, precise, the script of a man trained to keep records. "We are being unmade here," he wrote. "Not through cruelty, which we expected and could have resisted, but through kindness, which we cannot. They feed us, house us, and allow us to plant gardens and play music. Each day, it becomes harder to remember why we are enemies. Each day, I understand more clearly how thoroughly we were deceived." He paused, his pen hovering over the page. Then he added, "And yet I am grateful for this deception's end, even if it means admitting all the previous deceits we accepted as truth." In August, the first letters arrived from Germany. Not many. The mail service was irregular at best, and many addresses were no longer valid, buried under rubble or evacuated or simply gone. But some letters found their way across the Atlantic and into the hands of men who both desperately wanted and desperately feared news from home. Hartman received a letter from his sister, Margarethe, written in pencil on paper so thin he could see through it. She lived in Dresden with her 2 children. His brother-in-law had died at Stalingrad. She was managing, she wrote, but it was difficult. Food was scarce. The ration cards gave them barely enough to survive. She had traded her wedding ring for half a loaf of bread the previous week. "The bombing gets worse," she wrote. "We spend every night in the cellars now. Little Hans asks when his papa is coming home, and I do not know what to tell him. Some days I envy you, Otto. At least you are safe. At least you are far from this." Hartman read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his footlocker. That evening, he could not eat dinner. The beef stew sat on his plate, cooling. While he stared at nothing, Brenner noticed. "Bad news from home? My sister traded her wedding ring for bread," Hartman said flatly. "While I eat beef stew and complain that the coffee is not strong enough." The guilt was choking. They were prisoners, yes, but they were safe prisoners. Well-fed prisoners. Prisoners who slept in beds and grew tomatoes and listened to music. Back home, children starved. Cities burned. And what were they doing? Playing at farming in the Mississippi Sunday. Weber received no letters. His family had been in Hamburg. He knew what had happened to Hamburg. Every night, he lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, running through possibilities. Maybe they had evacuated. Maybe they had been somewhere else that night. Maybe, maybe, maybe. But probability was a cruel mathematician, and the odds were not in his favor. One evening, Morrison found Weber standing alone by the fence, staring out at the dark pines beyond. The commandant stood beside him in silence for a long moment before speaking. "My son is in the Pacific," Morrison said quietly. "Marine Corps. Last letter I got from him was 3 weeks ago. He said they were preparing for something big, but he could not say what. Every morning I wake up wondering if today is the day I get the telegram saying he is not coming home." Weber glanced at the older man. "Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand that we are not so different. You worry about your family. I worry about mine. You did not start this war any more than my son did. But we are all paying for it. It is not the same," Weber said bitterly. "Your son fights for a just cause. I fought for." He trailed off, unable to finish. "You fought because you were ordered to," Morrison said. "You wore the uniform of your country and followed the orders you were given. That does not make you evil. It makes you a soldier. What you do now that you know the truth, that is what will define you." The next day, Colonel Vogel received a letter that changed everything. It was from his wife, Anna, who lived in Munich with their teenage daughter. The letter was 4 pages long, crammed with small handwriting to fit more words on the precious paper. Vogel read it once, quickly, then again slowly. Then he sat down on his bunk and wept. Hartmann found him an hour later, the letter still clutched in his hand. "Heinrich? What happened?" Vogel looked up, his face blotchy and wet. "She writes that they are grateful for the bombing." "What?" "The bombing of Munich," she says. He consulted the letter with shaking hands. "She says that each bomb that falls is one less that must be dropped later, that the sooner the city falls, the sooner this madness ends. She writes that their neighbors were taken away last month, Jews, the whole family, even the children, and nobody said anything because we were all too afraid." He crumpled the letter. "She writes that she hopes I never come home if I still believe in what we fought for. She writes that she would rather be a widow to a dead man than a wife to a monster." The words hung in the air like smoke. Hartmann sat beside his friend, uncertain what comfort he could offer. What comfort could there be? Vogel's wife had not rejected him personally. She had rejected what he represented, what they had all represented. The uniform, the ideology, the whole rotten structure they had propped up with their obedience. "She is right," Vogel said finally. "About all of it. We knew. Maybe we did not know the details, but we knew enough. We heard the rumors. We saw the transports. We asked no questions because we did not want answers. That Sunday, Morrison allowed them to hold a church service. It was voluntary. Some attended, some did not. A chaplain from a nearby town came to lead the service, an elderly Lutheran minister named Reverend Thomas Müller, whose own parents had emigrated from Germany 50 years prior. Reverend Müller preached in English, with Private Henderson translating haltingly into German. The sermon was about redemption, about how it was never too late to choose the right path, about how God's grace was infinite, even when human grace was not. Brenner sat in the back, listening. He was not particularly religious. The military had burned most of that out of him, but something in the words struck deep. It was never too late to choose the right path. But was that true? Could you choose a new path after you had already walked so far down the wrong one? Could you be redeemed when you carried so much blood on your hands, even if you had never personally pulled a trigger? After the service, he approached the Reverend. "Father, may I ask you something?" "Of course, my son. I have done terrible things," Brenner said. "Not personally, perhaps. I gave orders, and other men carried them out. But the distinction feels meaningless. How does one live with that? How does one find peace?" Müller looked at him with eyes that held both sadness and understanding. "You begin by acknowledging the truth. Then you do what you can to make amends. And then you live each day trying to be better than you were the day before. Will it be enough? Perhaps not. But it is all we have. And if God does not forgive, then you must try to forgive yourself, which is often the harder task. September brought cooler weather, though in Mississippi that meant merely tolerably hot instead of unbearably so. The garden was producing now, tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their trellises, and squash sprawled across the ground in verdant abundance. The German officers took pride in their harvest. Each evening, they collected vegetables and delivered them to the mess hall kitchen. The head cook, Sergeant Bobby Lee Patterson, a massive man from Alabama with hands like dinner plates, received their offerings with genuine enthusiasm. "That is some fine-looking produce, gentlemen," he boomed, examining a cluster of tomatoes. "These will make a mighty fine sauce. You got a gift for this." Vogel, who had taken charge of the garden committee, actually smiled. "My father would be proud. He always said I had too much education and not enough sense to grow anything but older." Patterson laughed, a sound like thunder. "Well, you proved him wrong. Tell you what, I will make a special dish tomorrow using these tomatoes. You grow them, I will cook them. Fair trade?" The next evening, the mess hall served pasta with fresh tomato sauce. The tomatoes from their garden still warm from the afternoon sundae. The American soldiers ate it. The German prisoners ate it. The same sauce, the same meal, shared between enemies who were slowly, inexplicably, becoming something else. Hartman sat with his plate, chewing thoughtfully. The sauce was simple tomatoes, garlic, basil, olive oil. But it was their tomatoes. Something they had planted, tended, harvested, food they had created from earth and sun and water. There was a satisfaction in that which went beyond mere flavor. "We are being seduced," Major Dietrich said, keeping his voice low. "Do you not see it? They feed us. Let us play at farming. Give us music and books and letters from home. They are breaking us down, making us forget who we are." "And who are we?" Brenner asked quietly. "Are we still soldiers of the Reich? Or are we simply men who made a terrible mistake and now must live with the consequences?" Dietrich had no answer. That week, Morrison announced a new program. American soldiers learning German could practice with willing German prisoners during designated evening hours. It would be voluntary on both sides, supervised, and strictly non-political. The goal was simple: language exchange. Several German officers volunteered, partly from boredom, partly from curiosity. Hartman found himself paired with Private Henderson, whose grandmother's Bavarian German was apparently quite different from what Hartman spoke. They met in the recreation hall, sitting at opposite sides of a table, a dictionary between them. Henderson's notebook was full of carefully written German phrases, many of them wrong in creative ways. "Ich habe Hunger," Henderson read carefully. "I have. Hunger? I am hungry," Hartman corrected. "In German we say we have hunger, but in English you say you are hungry. Languages are strange." "Yes, sir. Languages are very strange." Henderson tried again. "Wo ist die Bibliothek?" Where is the library? Very good. But here, in the camp, we have no Bibliothek. We have Erholungsraum, recreation room. Henderson wrote that down, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. "My grandma used to tell me stories," he said, still writing, "about Germany. She came over right before the last war, said it was the most beautiful place in the world, mountains and forests and castles." "It is beautiful," Hartman agreed. "Or it was. I do not know what is left now." They worked through various phrases, greetings, directions, basic conversation. Henderson was not a natural linguist, but he tried hard, and there was something touching about his earnest effort. "Why do you want to learn German?" Hartman asked. Henderson looked up from his notebook. "I guess, well, sir, my grandma always said that language is how you understand people. That if you speak someone's language, even badly, it shows respect. And after the war, when it is over, I mean, there will still be Germany. There will still be Germans. We will have to talk to each other somehow. Your grandmother sounds wise. She is, or was. She died last year." Henderson's face clouded. "I think it would have made her sad, this war. Her old country, and her new country. Fighting. She used to say that people were mostly the same everywhere. They want food, safety, family. She said governments start wars, but people just want to live. Hartman thought about that as they continued their lesson. People just want to live. It sounded so simple. So why had it become so complicated? Why had wanting to live, to thrive, to secure the future, led to such catastrophic choices? After the language session, Hartman walked back to his barracks in the cooling evening air. The camp was quiet, the day's heat finally dissipating. From the American Guard's quarters came the sound of a radio big band music, the kind of brassy American jazz that the Nazis had banned as degenerate. Brenner stood outside his door, also listening. "They are quite terrible," he said. "All that noise and chaos." "Yes," Hartman agreed, but he found himself tapping his foot anyway. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. A civilian car pulled into camp unusual enough to draw attention, and a man in an expensive suit emerged, carrying a briefcase. He met with Morrison for an hour. Then Morrison summoned several senior German officers to his office. The man introduced himself as Harold Chen, a representative from the International Red Cross. He was there to inspect the camp and ensure Geneva Convention compliance. For the next 2 days, Chen interviewed prisoners, examined facilities, reviewed records, and took extensive notes. His final meeting was with the senior officers, including Brenner, Hartman, and Vogel. "Gentlemen," Chen said, "I have visited many POW camps across several countries. I am required to submit reports about conditions, treatment, and compliance with international agreements. I want to ask you directly, have you been mistreated in any way? Have you been denied medical care, adequate food, or proper shelter? Have you been subjected to forced labor, torture, or inhumane punishment?" The Germans exchanged glances. Finally, Brenner spoke. "Mr. Chen, I will be honest. When we were captured, we expected the worst. We expected starvation, beatings, perhaps execution. We have experienced none of those things. We are fed the same rations as American soldiers. We have beds, clothing, and medical care. We are allowed to grow gardens, play music, receive mail. We are treated with a dignity we did not anticipate." Chen made notes. "And compared to camps you may have knowledge of in Germany?" Silence. Heavy. And thick. "I understand this is difficult," Chen continued, "but I must document everything. The treatment of prisoners in this war will be examined for years to come. Honesty now may help establish important precedents." Vogel spoke up, his voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Chen, I have personal knowledge of camps in Poland and Russia. The conditions were not comparable to this. Prisoners were not treated as soldiers. They were treated as less than animals. Food was deliberately withheld. Labor was forced to the point of death. I saw things I cannot unsee." Chen's pen moved across his paper. "And here we grow tomatoes," Vogel said softly. "Here we play Beethoven on Sunday afternoons. Here a young American soldier tries to learn my language because his grandmother taught him that understanding begins with words." Chen closed his notebook. "Thank you, gentlemen. Your testimony will be included in my report. I want you to know that what happens here, the treatment you receive, it matters, not just for you, but for every prisoner in every war that follows. We are setting precedents. We are establishing that even in war, humanity can persist." After Chen left, the officers sat in Morrison's office, processing what had just happened. Finally, Hartman spoke. "We are being shown what we should have been," he said. "They treat us as we should have treated our prisoners. Not because we deserve it, but because this is how civilized nations behave. It is a lesson, a painful one." Morrison, who had been silent throughout, nodded. "War brings out the worst in us, but it can also reveal the best. We choose which version we want to be." "Some of us chose wrong," Brenner said. "Then choose right now," Morrison replied. "You cannot change the past, but the future is unwritten. October arrived with a shocking coolness. The Mississippi humidity finally broke, replaced by crisp mornings and evenings that hinted at the approaching winter. The garden began its decline, the summer vegetables giving way to autumn's harvest. The German officers collected the last tomatoes, the final beans, and prepared the soil for its winter rest. Weber stood alone in the garden one evening, long after the others had gone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him painfully of Hamburg burning. He knelt in the dirt, ostensibly pulling weeds, but really just needing to be alone with his thoughts. He did not hear Morrison approach until the commandant was beside him. "Your family was in Hamburg," Morrison said. It was not a question. Weber's hands stilled in the soil. "Yes. Have you received any word?" "No. Nothing. And that itself is an answer, is it not?" Morrison said nothing for a long moment. Then he sat down on the ground beside Weber, disregarding the dirt on his uniform. "I will not insult you with false hope, but I will tell you that absence of news is not always confirmation. Mail services are disrupted. People are displaced. Sometimes silence is simply silence, and sometimes it is death. Yes, sometimes it is that." Weber finally looked at the American colonel. "Why do you do this? Sit in the dirt with your enemy? Offer comfort when you should offer nothing? Because you are not my enemy anymore," Morrison said simply. "You are a man who is grieving. And while I cannot bring your family back, I can at least acknowledge your pain." Weber felt tears on his face, hot against his cheeks. He had not cried since childhood, had trained himself to view emotion as weakness. But here, in a prison garden in Mississippi, with an enemy officer sitting beside him in the dirt, he finally let himself break. Morrison did not try to stop him, did not offer platitudes. Just sat there, a hand on Weber's shoulder, while the younger man wept for everything he had lost. That night, several officers gathered in Brenner's room. They had taken to meeting informally in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss mundane matters, but really just to talk, to process, to try to make sense of their situation. "We need to speak about what comes after," Hartmann said. "Germany will lose. That much is clear. The only question is when, and how completely. What happens to us when the war ends?" "We go home," Dietrich said automatically. "To what?" Vogel asked. "To cities that are rubble? To families that may not exist? To a country that will hate us for losing? Hate us for participating? Hate us for surviving when so many did not?" "We are officers," Dietrich insisted. "We have skills, experience, education. We will rebuild." "And if Germany does not want us to rebuild?" Brenner asked quietly. "If the victors decide that everyone who wore this uniform is complicit, what then?" The question hung in the air. They had all thought about it, worried about it, but no one had voiced it so directly until now. "I have been thinking," Vogel said slowly, "about collaboration." "You cannot be serious," Dietrich said sharply. "Not collaboration against Germany, collaboration with the truth." The Red Cross man asked about camps, about treatment of prisoners, about what we knew. What if, when this war ends, what if some of us spoke, testified, told the truth about what was done in Germany's name? "That would be treason," Dietrich said flatly. "Treason against what?" Brenner asked. "Against a regime that lied to us from the beginning? Against a government that sent millions to their deaths for insane ideology?" Heinrich is right. Someone has to tell the truth. Someone has to stand up and say, "This is what happened. This is what we allowed to happen, and it must never happen again." "They will call us traitors," Hartmann said, "collaborators with the enemy." "Let them," Vogel said with quiet intensity. "My wife wrote that she would rather I never come home than come home still believing the lies. I will not be that man. I cannot be that man anymore." Dietrich stood abruptly. "I cannot listen to this. We are still German officers. We still have honor." "Honor?" Brenner's voice was cold. "We followed orders to commit atrocities and called it honor. We looked away from genocide and called it loyalty." honor. We let our country become an engine of death and called it patriotism. I am done with that kind of honor, Dietrich. Done. Dietrich left, slamming the door behind him. The remaining officers sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Weber spoke. His voice was hoarse from crying earlier. My family is probably dead, burned alive in an inferno we helped create. Not we personally, but we as officers, we as soldiers, we as Germans who allowed this to happen. I have to believe their deaths meant something. I have to believe that maybe, by speaking truth now, I can prevent other families from burning. The Americans will use us, Hartmann warned. Use our testimony for propaganda, for justification, for their own purposes. So let them, Vogel said. If our words can help build something better from the ashes, then use us. We are already prisoners. We have already lost everything else. What do we have left to lose except our silence? They talked late into the night, voices rising and falling, debating, arguing, confessing. By the time they finally dispersed to their own rooms, something had shifted. A decision had been made, though not formally, not officially. They would tell the truth, whatever the cost. The next morning, Brenner requested a private meeting with Morrison. In the commandant's office, he spoke carefully, choosing words with the precision of a man who understands their weight. Colonel Morrison, some of us have been discussing what will happen after the war ends. We understand that there will likely be trials, war crimes, tribunals. We want you to know that we are willing to testify about conditions in German camps, about treatment of prisoners, about orders we received and operations we witnessed. Not all of us, some still believe remaining silent is the honorable course, but enough of us are willing. Morrison studied him carefully. You understand what you are offering? You will be called traitors by many of your countrymen. Your names will be cursed. You may never be able to safely return to Germany. I understand. We all understand. But someone must speak the truth. Someone must stand up and say, this happened, and it was wrong. Let it be us. Let those of us who wore the uniform accept the responsibility that comes with it. Morrison was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded. I will report this to my superiors. When the time comes, if testimony is needed, I will recommend you. But, Field Marshal Brenner, I want you to understand something. You are not doing this to earn leniency. You are not doing this to secure better treatment. You are doing this because it is right. Remember that when it becomes difficult, I will. As Brenner left the office, he felt lighter somehow. The decision was made. The die was cast. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing he had chosen truth over loyalty to lies. November brought the first frost. The garden, stripped of its summer abundance, lay bare and brown, waiting for spring. But in the camp workshops, a different kind of growth was happening. Morrison had arranged for various vocational training opportunities. German officers could take classes in carpentry, electrical work, mechanical repair, and other practical skills. The idea was both humanitarian, giving them useful work to do, and practical. When the war ended, Germany would need to be rebuilt. Men with skills would be valuable. Hartmann found himself in the carpentry shop, learning to joint boards and cut proper dovetails. His hands, accustomed to holding pens and pointing at maps, slowly adapted to hammers and saws. The instructor was an older American sergeant named Martin Blake, who had been a carpenter in civilian life, and spoke with the slow patience of a man who truly loved his craft. You measure twice, cut once, Blake said for the 100th time as Hartmann lined up a cut. Rushing just wastes wood and time. The precision of carpentry appealed to Hartmann's military mind. There were rules, proper techniques, right and wrong ways to do things, but unlike military rules, which often led to death and destruction, carpentry rules led to something tangible and useful. A chair, a table, a box with tight joints that would last for years. Weber worked in the electrical shop, winding copper coils and learning about circuits and current. The mathematics of electricity made sense to him in a way that the chaos of war never had. Everything in electricity followed predictable rules. Apply voltage, current flows. Resistance creates heat. Power equals current times voltage. Simple, logical, peaceful. One afternoon, he successfully wired a lamp from scratch. When he flipped the switch and the bulb glowed, he felt a surge of satisfaction completely different from any military achievement. This light would hurt no one. It would simply illuminate darkness. What a strange concept. After years of creating darkness, Vogel joined the mechanic's shop, learning to repair engines. He had always been interested in how things worked, and engines were like puzzles with their interlocking pieces and systems. The American instructor, a Louisiana Cajun named Antoine Boudreau, spoke English with such a thick accent that it took Vogel weeks to understand half of what he said. "You got to feel the engine," Boudreau said, placing Vogel's hand on a running motor. "Feel that vibration? That tell you everything. Too rough. Something out of balance. Too smooth. Maybe the timing off. You learn to listen with your hand, not just your ear." Vogel learned to listen with his hands. He learned to diagnose problems by feel and sound. He learned that fixing things was more satisfying than breaking them, which seemed like an obvious truth but felt revolutionary to a man who had spent years in an army of destruction. The workshops became gathering places. Germans and Americans worked side by side, united by the practical need to fix things, build things, create things. Language barriers fell away in the face of shared tasks. You did not need perfect English to understand how to hold a board while someone else cut it. You did not need fluent German to appreciate a well-soldered joint. Private Henderson had been assigned to the carpentry shop, and he and Hartman often worked together. Their language lessons had evolved into a genuine friendship, strange as that seemed. They talked while they worked, Henderson improving his German and Hartman improving his English. "What will you do after the war?" Henderson asked one day, carefully planing a board smooth. Hartman had to think about that. "I do not know. Perhaps I will be a carpenter. Make furniture instead of war. You would be good at it. You got the precision for it. And you? Will you stay in the army?" Henderson laughed. "Lord, no. Soon as they let me, I am going home to Iowa. Gonna help my pa with the farm. Plant corn. Raise pigs. Never shoot at anyone. Ever again." "That sounds nice," Hartman said. And he meant it. It sounded impossibly nice. That evening, Sergeant Blake asked Hartman to stay after the others had left. In the quiet workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and wood oil, Blake showed him a project he had been working on. "It is a cradle," Blake said, running his hand over smooth maple wood. "My daughter, she just had a baby. My first grandchild. I am making this to send home to her." The cradle was beautiful, simple, clean lines, joints so tight you could barely see them. Blake had carved a pattern of leaves along the headboard, each one distinct and delicate. "You made this here? In the prison camp? Workshop is open to American personnel too. I come here in the evenings. Helps me think." Blake looked at Hartman. "I wanted to show you this because I want you to understand something. I do not know what you did in the war. Do not want to know, really. But I know what you are doing now. You are learning to build instead of destroy. That matters. That is worth something." He handed Hartman the sandpaper. "Help me smooth this last side panel. Then I will show you how to apply the finish." They worked together in comfortable silence, German prisoner and American jailer, putting the final touches on a cradle that would hold a baby who did not care about nations or uniforms or the terrible things men did to each other in wartime. December brought real cold, at least by Mississippi standards. The German officers, accustomed to Russian winters, found the southern chill almost amusing, but they appreciated the heating in the barracks and the thick coats the Americans provided. Christmas approached, and with it, a strange melancholy. This would be their second Christmas in captivity for most of them. The war ground on in Europe, though the news made it clear that the end was approaching. Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany from both east and west. Cities fell. The Reich contracted. Morrison allowed them to decorate the mess hall for Christmas. The Germans made ornaments from scraps of wood and metal from the workshops. Someone fashioned a star from tin. They hung pine branches and tried to make the space feel festive, though every decoration reminded them of homes they might never see again. On Christmas Eve, the camp held a combined service. American and German soldiers gathered in the chapel, a multi-purpose room, with borrowed religious symbols, and sang carols together. Silent Night, composed by an Austrian, sung in German and English simultaneously, voices blending in the candlelit space. Brenner stood in the back, listening. The young American soldiers sang with earnest enthusiasm. The German prisoners sang with painful nostalgia. And for 3 minutes, there was only music and shared humanity. After the service, Morrison approached Brenner with an envelope. This arrived today. From Washington. They are moving forward with the war crimes tribunals. The first will be held in Nuremberg, they think, after the surrender. They want preliminary statements from willing witnesses. I told them about your offer. They have sent questions. Brenner took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. This was it. The moment of commitment. He could still refuse. Could claim he had changed his mind. Could remain silent and comfortable in his captivity. He opened the envelope and read the questions. They were detailed, specific, damning. What orders did you receive regarding treatment of prisoners? What conditions did you observe in camps under your jurisdiction? What communications did you have with higher command regarding civilian populations? What actions did you take, or fail to take, that you now recognize as criminal? They do not ask easy questions, Brenner said. They should not. The answers will help determine how we prevent this from ever happening again. That night, Brenner began writing. He wrote about orders received from Berlin. He wrote about camps he had inspected in Poland, where prisoners were worked to death. He wrote about reports he had seen and questions he had not asked. He wrote about his own failures, his own moral cowardice, his own complicity. The words came slowly, painfully. Each sentence was a confession. Each paragraph, an admission of guilt. But he kept writing, because silence had already caused enough damage. Vogel and Weber also received questionnaires. They too began writing, sitting at the desks in their small rooms, struggling with the weight of honesty. Hartmann did not receive a questionnaire. His record was cleaner, mostly combat command, less exposure to the worst atrocities. But he felt guilty about that too, as if his lesser crimes made him less worthy to testify. You have nothing to feel guilty about regarding your cleaner record, Morrison told him when Hartmann expressed this. You cannot help what orders you received or did not receive, but you can help now by speaking about what you did see. Even small testimonies matter. They build a complete picture. New Year's came quietly. 1,945 arrived, with little fanfare, just another day in captivity, another day waiting for the war to end. But the men who were writing their testimonies felt something shift. They were no longer merely prisoners waiting. They were witnesses preparing to speak. In mid-January, news arrived that Soviet forces had liberated Auschwitz. The reports that filtered through were almost impossible to comprehend. Thousands dead, gas chambers, crematoria, industrial murder on a scale that defied imagination. The German officers gathered in the mess hall as Morrison shared what information he had received. The room was silent as he read from the intelligence reports. Several men went pale. Weber left abruptly, his hand over his mouth. I did not know, Dietrich said. I swear I did not know it was that bad, but we knew something, Vogel said quietly. We knew enough to know we should ask questions. And we did not ask. That night, Vogel added 10 more pages to his testimony. His hand ached from writing, but he could not stop. Every word was a small penance. Insufficient, but necessary. By February, several completed testimonies had been sent to Washington. Morrison informed them that the military lawyers were impressed with the detail and candor. The statements would be valuable in the coming trials. There will be backlash, Morrison warned. When this becomes public, and it will, many Germans will view you as traitors. You may never be able to return home safely. Home, Brenner repeated. I am not sure Germany is home anymore. Perhaps it never truly was. Perhaps we only thought it was home because we refused to see what it actually was. Spring began to show itself in early March. The garden soil thawed. The German officers prepared to plant again a third year of captivity, a third growing season in exile. But this time felt different. This time they planted not just a pastime, but as an act of faith that there would be a future worth growing food for. April 1945 brought cascading news. Allied forces crossed the Rhine. Hitler retreated to his bunker in Berlin. The Reich was collapsing, not gradually but catastrophically. Like a building whose foundation had been blasted away, the German officers gathered each evening to read the latest reports. There was no triumph in the news, only a grim satisfaction that the nightmare was finally ending. But with the end came uncertainty. What would happen to them? What would happen to Germany? What would happen to everyone they had known? On April 30th, news came that Hitler was dead. Suicide in his bunker, the report said. As Soviet troops fought in the streets above him, the camp fell into strange silence. The Americans did not celebrate, there was still war in the Pacific. And the European victory felt too Pyrrhic for triumphalism. The German prisoners did not mourn. What was there to mourn? The death of a madman who had led their nation to ruin. Brenner stood in the garden, looking at the young tomato plants he had started from seed. Hitler was dead, but these tomatoes would still grow. Cities were rubble, but the sun still rose. Millions had died, but life persisted. There was something both terrible and hopeful in that. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. Unconditionally. Completely. The war in Europe was over. Morrison gathered all the German prisoners in the mess hall. He stood before them, his face grave. Gentlemen, the war is over. Your nation has surrendered. You are no longer enemy combatants. You are now simply prisoners awaiting repatriation. What that repatriation looks like, I do not yet know. But I want you to understand something. He paused, looking over the assembled men. You have been held here under the rules of war. Those rules still apply. You will continue to be treated with dignity and respect. You will continue to receive adequate food, shelter, and care. You will remain here until arrangements can be made for your return to Germany. And if we do not wish to return? Vogel asked. Morrison met his eyes. That is a question I cannot yet answer. But I will make sure it is asked to the proper authorities. That night, the German officers held their own gathering. No Americans present, just the men who had shared 2 years of captivity together. I cannot go back, Weber said. My family is dead. My city is destroyed. I have no home to return to. None of us have homes, Hartmann said. Not the homes we left. Those are gone, but perhaps we can build new ones. Where? Dietrich asked bitterly. We are war criminals. Traitors. Where would we build anything? Here, perhaps, Vogel suggested. America took immigrants before. Perhaps they will again. We have skills now, trades. We can work. We can be useful. Brenner listened to the discussion without contributing. He had been thinking about this question for months. Finally, he spoke. I will go back to Germany, he said. Not because I want to, but because I must. Someone needs to help rebuild. And it should be people who understand what went wrong. We cannot leave Germany only to those who still believe the lies. We must go back and tell the truth, again and again, until it cannot be denied. They will hate us for it, Hartmann said. Let them. Their hatred is earned. But perhaps in time, when the hatred fades, the truth will remain. That is worth returning for. The next few weeks brought a steady stream of bureaucracy. Forms to fill out, statements to give, medical examinations, documentation of their time in captivity. The machinery of peace was more complex than the machinery of war. In June, representatives from the new Allied Control Council came to interview prisoners about their wishes. Some wanted immediate repatriation. Others wanted to delay. A few inquired about staying in America permanently. When it was Brenner's turn, he stated clearly, I wish to return to Germany to assist in reconstruction and to testify in any tribunals that require my presence. I understand that I may face charges myself. I accept that possibility, The interviewer, a British colonel, raised his eyebrows. "You are volunteering to potentially incriminate yourself?" "I am volunteering to tell the truth. Whatever consequences follow from that truth, I will accept." July brought the first departures. A group of junior officers who had clean records and families waiting for them were sent back first. They boarded trucks with mixed emotions: relief, fear, uncertainty. The camp felt emptier without them. The senior officers remained, their status more complicated, their futures more uncertain, but their routine continued. They worked in the shops. They tended the garden. They wrote testimonies and statements. They prepared. One August morning, Henderson found Hartman in the carpentry shop. The young private carried a newspaper, his face strange. "Sir, you should see this." The headline was about the atomic bomb. Japan devastated. 2 cities erased. The war would end soon, everyone said. Days, not months. Hartman read the article carefully, then set down the newspaper. He thought about Hamburg burning, about firestorms that melted steel. He thought about cities turned to ash in an instant. He thought about how humanity's capacity for destruction kept expanding. "We will destroy ourselves eventually," he said quietly. "Unless we learn." "Learn what, sir?" "That the same intelligence that can split an atom can also choose not to use that weapon. That power without wisdom is just destruction, with better tools." Henderson looked young and uncertain. "Do you think we will learn?" "I do not know. But we must try. What other choice do we have?" On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was truly over. Every war, everywhere, finally done. The camp held a service of thanksgiving. Americans and Germans gathered together, united not by nation, but by shared relief that the killing had finally stopped. They sang hymns and prayed, each in their own language, to the same God. In September, the first Nuremberg trials began. Several Camp Clinton prisoners were transported to Germany to testify. Brenner, Vogel, and Weber were among them. They said their goodbyes to the others, knowing they might never see them again. Hartman shook Brenner's hand at the truck. "Tell the truth. Always," Brenner promised. Those who remained waited. October passed. November came again, 3 years since their capture. The garden needed preparing for winter one final time. In December, Hartman received his repatriation orders. He would leave in January, returning to a Germany he did not know, to help rebuild a nation from ashes. His last evening at Camp Clinton, he walked through the empty garden with Morrison. They had become something like friends over the years, though neither would have used that word. "I wanted to thank you," Hartman said, "for treating us like men instead of animals, for showing us that humanity persists even in war." Morrison nodded. "The Geneva Convention required minimum standards. But we tried to exceed those standards because we understood something important. Today's enemy may be tomorrow's ally. How we treat you now affects what kind of relationship we will have for decades to come. Germany will rise again. Better that it rises with men who remember that Americans fed them well and taught them carpentry." "The food," Hartman said with a slight smile. "That first meal, beef stew that was better than our officers' banquets. That was the beginning, I think. The moment I realized everything I had been told was a lie." "Food has power," Morrison agreed. "Not just to sustain the body, but to nourish the soul. When you feed someone well, you tell them they matter. You tell them they are worth caring for. That is a powerful message." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Hartman spoke again. "I am afraid of going back. Germany is destroyed. So many dead. So much guilt. How do we live with what we allowed to happen? One day at a time," Morrison said. "One good choice at a time. One truth spoken at a time. Build a life worth living from the ruins of the life you had. You cannot change the past, but you can shape the future." The next morning, Hartman boarded a truck with the last group of Camp Clinton prisoners heading home. As they drove away, he looked back at the camp. The buildings looked small in the distance, The garden was invisible from this angle, but he knew it was there, waiting for spring, ready to grow again. Field Marshal Otto Brenner testified at Nuremberg for 3 days. His testimony was detailed, damning, and completely honest. He implicated himself along with others, accepting responsibility for orders given and questions not asked. Some called him a traitor. Others called him courageous. He called himself simply truthful. After the trials, he settled in a small town in Bavaria, using his Camp Clinton carpentry skills to make furniture. He never held military rank again, but he spent the rest of his life speaking to young Germans about the importance of questioning authority and choosing conscience over obedience. Colonel Heinrich Vogel immigrated to America in 1947. He opened a small engine repair shop in Mississippi, not far from where Camp Clinton had been. He married an American woman whose father had died at Anzio. They had 3 children who grew up speaking both German and English, carrying forward the lesson that enemies can become family. Colonel Friedrich Weber stayed in Germany but never found his family. The records showed they had died in Hamburg, as he had feared. He devoted himself to helping other families reunite, working tirelessly with displaced persons organizations to connect survivors. In his small apartment, he kept a photograph taken at Camp Clinton, the Garden Committee, Americans and Germans together, holding baskets of tomatoes and smiling despite everything. Major General Otto Hartmann returned to Stuttgart. The city was ruins, but slowly, brick by brick, it was rebuilt. He worked in reconstruction administration, using his organizational skills to help restore order from chaos. He never remarried after learning his wife had died in the bombing. But he mentored young Germans, teaching them that strength comes not from following orders blindly, but from having the courage to question them. Colonel Thaddeus Morrison remained in military service until 1950, then returned to his home in Virginia. He wrote a memoir about his experience running Camp Clinton, emphasizing the importance of maintaining humanity even in war. The book was not a bestseller, but it became required reading at several military academies. When asked what he was most proud of from his career, he always mentioned the garden at Camp Clinton, enemy soldiers growing food together, learning that even in captivity, life could flourish. Private Marcus Henderson went back to Iowa and farmed corn, just as he had planned. But he never forgot his German lessons with General Hartmann. His children learned German from their father, who told them stories about how speaking someone's language was the first step to understanding them as people. One of his sons became a translator at the United Nations. The garden at Camp Clinton was plowed under when the camp closed in 1946. The barracks were dismantled, the fences came down. The land returned to pine forest, as if the camp had never existed. But in a small archive in Jackson, Mississippi, there is a photograph. German field marshals and American soldiers standing together, holding vegetables they grew from the red clay soil, smiling despite being on opposite sides of the worst war in human history. The photograph is labeled in careful handwriting, Camp Clinton Victory Garden, Summer 1944. Victory, it turns out, takes many forms. Sometimes it comes from battles won. Sometimes it comes from gardens grown. Sometimes it comes from the simple act of feeding your enemy and thereby reminding them and yourself that beneath the uniforms and the ideologies and the terrible things war makes us do, we are all just human beings who need food, shelter, dignity, and hope. The German officers never forgot the taste of that first American meal. It was not the quality of the food that mattered. Though the food was good, it was what the food represented. That even in war, humanity could persist. That even between enemies, kindness was possible. That even in the darkest times, someone could choose to be decent. It tastes better than our banquets, Field Marshal Brenner had said. He was not talking about the food. He was talking about the future.